when someone started to write it. The best guesses I think that scholars can make is when it was finished. So finished at about 170 BC, but maybe some people were writing it for 100 years beforehand. But it seems to be definitely a Hellenistic book.
Okay. Hey, do you ever catch in there, just kind of as an aside, do you ever catch the little cameo of the Gilgamesh story in Daniel?
Oh, no, I didn't get that. Is that? Oh.
It's really interesting because there's a point in there where Nebuchadnezzar, they have that point where he goes crazy, becomes like an animal, and runs off into the wilderness.
Oh, right, and that's probably actually pertaining to a totally different king, Nabonidus, or Nabonidus. I don't know how to pronounce that.
Yeah, but that also is mentioned in the Epic of Gilgamesh, that Gilgamesh has the similar thing happen to him when his friend Enlil is killed by the gods, that he has a similar point where he just loses his mind and runs off into the wilderness. So
yes, of course.
It's based on an even older Babylonian, Mesopotamian story that kind of got blended into there too. So he makes a little cameo.
Okay, he makes a little cameo. But we do know that King Nabonidus actually did do that. He's one of the kookiest kings in Babylonian history, well, in world history. He basically is king of Babylon, and he decides, I'm going to have a holiday for 10 years. Right? Where are you going, O king? I'll just go out into the desert for a while and have some fun. Now, the Babylonian king had important religious functions throughout the year. So for him to disappear for 10 years would be the equivalent of the Pope saying, well, I'm going to spend the rest of my time in Barbados, and I won't be back for Easter or Christmas or any or that sort of stuff. You take care of it. So Nabonidus was just a kook, but apparently he was the first real archaeologist. He was interested in antiquities, and he became interested in the ancient history of his own country. Now, he's the king that got smashed by the Persians.
Okay.
So obviously not a brilliant military leader or even really a good king at all. In fact, just crazy.
Okay. Now, another book that you mentioned when you were talking on your most recent show with Steve Guerrera was Enoch. And
that's right.
Unfortunately, that's one that I have not had a chance to sit down and peruse through a whole lot. What is the big thing with Enoch? Because I know it was important to the early Christians because it even gets a spot or two mentioned in, I think, 1 Peter and in Jude. So how was it so influential?
First Enoch, because there's a whole bunch of books with the name Enoch in them, but First Enoch is an impressive work. It's 108 chapters. It's about the length of Genesis, and it makes Revelation look sensible.
Okay.
It is the first apocalyptic work that we know of. And by apocalyptic, we're talking, it introduces concepts like, it talks about the afterlife. It talks about the end of times. Concepts which are just not in the Old Testament at all. We have no idea where the author of Enoch got these things from. And they spring full-blown. And as far as we can tell, Enoch is really very early. It's about 400 BC. So that would predate Daniel by 300 years or so. Never made it into the canon, but it was certainly very important. One of the interesting things about Enoch is that it was preserved by the Ethiopian church, but it was widely believed, well, universally believed until the 20th century, that it was a Christian document, one of the, part of the vast Christian literature. And then that theory got blown out of the water when we found fragments from First Enoch in Aramaic in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that demonstrated it was a fundamental Jewish text. And from First Enoch springs, well, in a sense, Christianity to a large extent. The notion of Messiah, angels, the existence of evil is explained by evil angels. None of these things are in the Old Testament, but they're profoundly influential in Christianity. It's a very difficult read, believe me. You wouldn't want to do that unless you got it. Yeah, it's not bedtime reading.
Yeah, I've been thinking about trying to peruse through that because if I could sit through and read the entire Secret Book of John, I could probably handle Enoch. I don't know if you've ever heard of that one.
Okay, no, I'm not familiar with the Secret Book of John.
It's one of the books from the Nag Hammadi literature, And,
Okay.
and it was important enough to them that there were at least three it's written in three different codexes. There's a short version and then two long versions. And it is absolutely bonkers. There is I am not kidding you. There is an entire section of the Secret Book of John, that is dedicated to nothing but telling you which archon is responsible for what type of magic and what specific parts of the body. I mean, from the head to the spleen to everything has just got its own little archon that is responsible for that little part. And that takes up like pages upon pages just of that. And then going through the way that they talk about because the Gnostics, they had the aeons, which were like the different emanations from the source that just kind of spread out like ripples. And then our universe is way off at the back end of it. But right. It describes, I mean, by the time you're done, you've got at least 60 different aeons that have, these different, these aeonic beings in pairs that are over each part, just going on and on and on. And it's just crazy stuff.
Okay, well, that sounds like something you should be taking substances to understand.
Yeah, you either need that or you need to have just finished watching Pink Floyd's The Wall a couple of times. It is.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty sure if I can get through that, maybe Enoch won't be quite so hard.
Okay, I think you'll find Enoch is a lot drier.
Now, we were talking a little bit about how Babylon, Assyria, and even Persia, what kind of influences did they have on Judaism? Sorry.
You okay?
Yeah, I just hit my my little spit guard there over the mic.
Oh, okay. Right, it sounded like a movie noise or something you hear in a Bugs Bunny cartoon. Boing. I think the Jews were most influenced by the Persians. They must have got the fundamental ideas of dualism from Persia, because you don't find any sort of dualistic concepts in the Old Testament. So it's not till after the exile that dualism really does start peeking its head through in Judaism. So they must have got that from the Persians. And of course, they were in Babylon for 50 years as a fairly coherent community. So they must have been influenced by, I suppose, Babylon's scribal tradition, the libraries. I mean, it would have been like, for the Jews to go to Babylon, apart from the fact that they are actually being deported, which is a horrible thing, but they would have gone to the most urbane, cultured city in the entire Middle East, and one of the most cultured on the planet at the time, and discovered things like libraries, maybe street lighting, who knows? So this little rural people were influenced by that, and that must have really influenced the development of the later canon and even just writing it down. I mean, how many oral traditions were only written down after the Jews came back from the exile? And they said, hey, this thing, the Babylonians, they've got this thing called writing. Oh, really? Yeah, it's really good. So I think that there was that sort of influence.
Yeah, and that does make sense, because some of the things that I've heard was that they will date the birth of Jewish monotheism to the Babylonian exile. That it was at that point, because their gods had basically got their butts handed to them by the Babylonian gods, and so that means that their gods weren't as powerful, but that couldn't be, and they needed to stay together as a group. So, well, maybe it's that our God, Yahweh, is not just that he's one God among all of these other gods, but he is the God, and then that way he didn't get his butt kicked by the Assyrian gods. He just let everything happen. And then that was the synthesis finally, which had been evolving over the centuries, but that was finally the catalyst that brought it to a monotheism.
That sounds like a very reasonable hypothesis, yes. I mean, the Israelites basically had to recreate their entire theology, didn't they? And turn it away from, our God, is a powerful God and he will protect us, into explaining, well, how come we're not in, Judah anymore? What happened? So we have to reconstruct Yahweh you have to reconstruct all the historical actions of the Babylonians as part of God's will. And that must have been quite a theological wrenching.
Yeah, it would have been. And so I guess because before that you see hints throughout. Well, you see it really hard at the beginning of the Bible where he talks. I mean, it wasn't until I think 2nd Isaiah that there's finally the declaration that Yahweh says there are no gods but me. Before that, he says there are no gods before me, or you won't worship these other gods because you are my people and not their people. But it's not until you get to 2nd Isaiah, which was another post-Babylonian document, that you see this monotheism actually congeal as one solid thing.
Yeah, that would be true. That would be true. It's quite a late concept. I mean, there's very little evidence that either the Israelites or the Judeans were monotheistic in any sense. That's been retroactively pushed on them. And yeah, you're quite right. It's 2nd Isaiah or 3rd Isaiah, whichever one it was, that you only see these concepts really emerge for the first time.
And sounds like you got another plane coming.
Yeah, we had a good quiet stretch for a while, and now they're coming again. But it could be worse. My neighbour could decide to do some of their amateur carpentry.
It could be, or as late as it is out here, I could have my neighbors start to have a little fiesta next door too.
That's a point.
Now
my neighbour.
Go ahead.
Sorry, go on. No, it's okay.
Well, I was going to ask you about also, isn't Persia where we start to get the idea of a evil, not necessarily an evil god, but an evil angel in the form of Satan?
Yes. I don't know how much directly the ideas came from the Persians, but it's certainly in that period that Satan emerges as an independent power of God in Israelite thought. Until that time, and throughout the entire Old Testament, Satan is God's prosecuting attorney. They are best friends. Satan does nothing independent of God. Even in the book of Job, Satan is doing God's will. It's only in that time, in Persian times, that we find the notion that Satan is working against God and has a will independent of God. And that's an exciting new theological concept to add into the mix.
It is, and I think, I'm sorry if I maybe step on your toes on it, but I think maybe that was part of the Zoroastrianism, because you had, in there you had the good God and the evil God that were warring with each other, and eventually the good God conquers the evil God, but in the meantime it's still this constant battle. And when the Israelites when Israel was rescued by the Persians, they kind of pulled some of that Zoroastrian influence in, but they couldn't have a being that was as powerful as God, so they said, well, we have this guy Satan over here, this accusing angel that's mentioned in Job, we can just kind of pull him over and do it that way.
Yeah. As a side note, my neighbour actually is starting to do some amateur carpentry with a big buzzsaw.
Okay, well, I guess we better kind of wrap it up then.
It might be best, because when he gets going, like he's making a whole new deck or something.
Oh man,
God knows. Yeah.
Okay, well, so since we're going to have to kind of cut this short, how can people find your podcast, and how can they? Where can they find your website, your podcasts? Maybe ask you some questions.
Yeah, thanks for asking. The easiest way is to go to iTunes and then just do a search for History Bible. You'll find a lot of weird search items pop up, but I'll be there eventually in the podcast section. Or you can go to my website, and if you simply Google either my name, Garry Stevens, and that's 2 R's in Garry, folks, 2 R's in Garry, or History in the Bible, you should go to my website, and my website has a lot of supporting material for the podcast. So you'll find a lot of maps, diagrams, charts, lists of kings, so you can follow the confusing complexity of the Two Kingdoms period.
And it does get pretty confusing. Well, I know it's probably getting late in the afternoon for you over there, but I want to thank you again for coming on and sitting down and talking with me. It's been a lot of fun. It really has.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for the invite. Yes, that was good fun.
Okay, and I guess I will be waiting for your next episode to release. Is that going to be this week or this coming week, or are you taking a break?
No, it will release in 2 hours and 5 minutes.
Well, I'll definitely have to.
Yeah. And in fact, I've recorded the entire series right up to May.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, exactly. I have a lot of time on my hands.
Well, I'm lucky just to be able to schedule that far in advance. But well, well, thanks again for talking with me.